Hello and welcome to the Dr. Ayaz Safi Podcast. In today's episode, I'm delighted to have Dr. Richard Blagrove, a senior lecturer in Loughborough University. In this episode, Dr. Richard and I are delving into detailed conversation about sports science, sports endurance, running, health, and well-being. Dr. Richard, thank you for joining me.
Hey there, Safi, okay?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad at all. Great to see you.
And you too, mate. Thanks for your time. I know you're a super busy man, but thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, no worries at all. Yeah, I really appreciate the invite to come on. I was very flattered when you asked me.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, no worries. I feel like I should have dressed up a bit more. You look
No.
you look very smart compared to me.
Well, thank you. But you are the one who's going to talk more, so it's fine, Rich. Yeah.
It's really warm today, isn't it? It's like
It is
all of a sudden
actually, yeah.
we've had this change in weather, and
Yeah.
I'm shorts and t-shirt this week, which is nice.
Well, that's what a strength and conditioning coach wears, so it's fine. Yeah.
Even in the middle of winter, yeah.
Absolutely. Rich, well, again, thank you for joining me. Can we start by you telling us a little bit more about yourself? Because no matter how much I do the introduction, there is still so much I'm going to miss about you. So why don't you tell our audience a little bit more about yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. I'll try not to rabbit on and give listeners a full biography here. But so at the moment, I'm a senior lecturer in physiology at Loughborough University, where I teach a lot on our masters in strength and conditioning. Plus, I'm involved with quite a lot of research. And I've been at Loughborough since 2019. So yeah, nearly 5 years now, which has absolutely flown by. But prior to that, I was at Birmingham City University working with you for I think about 2 years or so.
Yes.
And then before that, I was based down in London at St Mary's University, Southwest London. And I was there for about 9 years. So in total, I've been in academia for about 16 years now. And yeah, when I started working in academia, I came from a coaching background. So I was a strength and conditioning coach. And so, although there's always this pressure in academia to be doing research, like I was quite keen to carry on my coaching. And so, in the early part of my lecturing career, I was very much still a strength and conditioning coach. And I kind of unintentionally specialised a little bit in work with middle and long distance runners. And so I was doing a lot with runners based in London for about 10 years or so. But yeah, more recently moved a little bit more into research and away from strength and conditioning coaching.
Well, that's excellent. And I think you are one of the renowned strength and conditioning coach, and also in physiology, that I know here in nationally and also internationally as well. So it's great to have you here with such a rich introduction.
That's really kind.
Oh, thank you. You mentioned about the physiology and also kind of in academia, but you still kind of kept on the coaching side of it going. Some of our listeners or viewers maybe kind of want to know, okay, how did you keep that balance of the two, for example, academia and also donor coaching? So do you mind sharing some of that at all? Like, how did you keep that balance? Because academia is a stressful job as it is. And then in addition to it, you kind of done the coaching.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends a little bit on the institution that you work at, because as you know, having worked in academia for a few years now, you have institutions that are like a very teaching and learning focus. So the priorities on student recruitment and student experience and just delivering a really, really high quality product to the students that are at the university. And that was very much the case at St Mary's University. So although there was always research going on and there was some really good researchers there was probably a little bit less pressure to be heavily involved with like really high quality research. And so I ended up enrolling on my PhD quite late, but it kind of afforded me the opportunity to keep doing what I was enjoying at the time, and that was coaching. So yeah, as I said, initially that was multi-sport, and then gradually I started working more and more with runners and kind of specialised it in that area. But you kind of contrast that now to the university that I'm now working at, which is a much more research intensive environment.
Yeah.
And so a lot of my own kind of personal goals each year are based around trying to hit targets associated with grant income generation and publications of a certain quality. And so you obviously have to dedicate quite a bit more time to getting PhD students and potentially postdoctoral researchers and so on in order to make sure that research is really high quality. So yeah, I guess it's just about like shifting emphasis really, and that's partly down to what you enjoy and partly down to what you're placed under pressure with.
Well, absolutely. Let's talk about the runners and the long endurance for a minute. We've recently seen the marathon and half marathon, for example, 10K as well, which I also participated in the great run here in Birmingham on Sunday. And we also see so many people comes from all walks of life, old, young, all gender, for example, all of mixed abilities. And especially when I was running on Sunday, I saw people of different age and different ability, walking, jogging, running, sprinting as well. I just wanted to get to that, the end line, for example. What are some of the key physiological factors that contribute to the success in a middle and long distance running events?
Yeah, I'll try not to make this too overly scientific, but there's three main physiology factors that kind of dictate or limit performance in middle and long distance running. The first and probably the most important is something called VO2 max or maximal oxygen uptake. And so that represents the highest amount of oxygen that you can essentially get into your body, and then combined with carbohydrates and fats, it essentially your ability to produce energy in the presence of oxygen. So to kind of like, we can measure that directly in the laboratory, and to kind of bring it to life a little bit. Like I imagine the person that crossed the line first in the great run event in Birmingham at the weekend, like on the male side, their VO2 max was probably about mid-70s, like somewhere around there. And with the really elite runners, we see it go into the low 80s. Whereas with the more recreational runner, it's probably somewhere in the 40s. Like if you're quite a well-trained recreational runner, it's probably low 50s to mid-50s. So it gives you an idea of the sort of differences in VO2 max. The second important physiological factor is, like, it's termed different things in the literature, but it's essentially the percentage of your VO2 max that you can reach for a given distance or duration. And so if we take VO2 max as our kind of ceiling of aerobic capacity, like the closer that we can get to that for a half marathon, the better. And so again, you see really highly trained marathon runners that can get somewhere around 85% of their VO2 max and then hold it there for an entire marathon distance, which is quite phenomenal. So they're operating not far off their max for about 2.5 hours. Whereas again, for a more recreational runner, they're operating at more like 60% of that. So there's quite big differences in the fraction of VO2 max that you can access. And then the third thing is something called running economy. Sometimes people call it running efficiency. And that's essentially how effectively you can convert the energy that you've got within your muscles into movement or your running technique. And so the lower that value is, the better. And so you see really elite runners that have got really, really efficient and economical techniques, and they don't actually use very much energy to sustain quite a fast-paced effort. Whereas again, with more recreational runners, they actually use up quite a lot of energy to run at quite a slow speed. And it's again something that we can see that we can change quite a lot with training and different types of training. So yeah, it's mostly those three things. It's probably worth mentioning really quickly that with more middle distance events, so like the 800 and the 1500 meters, there's quite a large anaerobic component. And so things like maximal sprint speed and how fast that you can run like a lap of the athletics track, like 400 meters, also become really important. And that's more down to how effectively you can create and use energy without oxygen. So just a kind of a muscle level. But certainly for the half marathon and the marathon, like those aerobic factors are the most important ones.
Right. You mentioned about the VO2 max at the start. And you also hinted to that one of the ways to measure that is in the laboratory, for example.
Yes.
Not everybody can get into the lab and test their VO2 max, especially the general public and the recreational runners. How would they kind of measure their VO2 max in addition to, or if there's any alternative to the lab measurement?
Yeah, it's a little bit more difficult outside the lab. Like a lot of your listeners might have experienced the bleep test, the multi-stage fitness
Yeah,
test,
yes.
or the yo-yo test. Like if you've played in a game sport, you've probably done those at some point.
Yeah.
And they're not too bad. So they give a pretty accurate prediction of VO2 max if you've got access to sort of like a tape recorder or and cones and so on. Like beyond that, there's other tests such as like a 12-minute run, which
Right.
and a 15-minute run, where if you can record the distance and then calculate the speed, they're not too bad at predicting VO2 max fairly accurately. Like I think in this day and age, if you're into running, like a lot of people have got these kind of wearable devices. Like I'm wearing one now.
Yeah.
Like my Garmin watch,
Mhm.
and yeah, they're not completely accurate, but they'll give a prediction of VO2 max based upon your heart rate and your maximal heart rate and the kind of intensities that you're operating at in your training. And like I know because I've been lucky enough to have my VO2 max measured in a laboratory, and I can compare it to what my watch is telling me. Like mine's actually quite accurate on my watch.
All right. Okay.
Pretty good. Whereas, I know some other wearable devices like tend to be less accurate. So they're not too bad. And I guess for somebody that doesn't want to pay to go to a laboratory and get the test done, you can rely on a watch like fairly well.
Yeah.
The main thing is you're seeing the number go up. So as you're training harder, and particularly if you're doing more interval training, like you can see the number on your watch starting to go up gradually, and that's the main thing. Like you're just getting fitter, basically.
Oh, nice. Well, thank you for that. And I think these new technological gadgets, these speedometers and the smartwatches, I think they are really good tools to kind of keep track of what people have been engaging in, and especially when it comes to health and physical activity and exercise aspects. So that's really good to know as well. So you mentioned that you have the Garmin one, and that's more fairly accurate compared to some others, which I think, some research also shows that Garmin is like one of the best ones as well, So yeah, thank you for that. And Rich, you kind of hinted towards this as well. Lots of people, they tend to do like strength training, and assuming that, okay, this may improve the running. And you also mentioned earlier the economy and the side and the energy side of it as well. What are some of the main mechanisms behind why you think, or from the research, that resistance training may benefit the endurance performance? Because different people I speak to, I personally do the resistance training. I do weightlifting as well, and training on my legs, especially when I was preparing for the half marathon, and wanted to kind of get those muscles strong and so on. But some people are saying, "Oh no, I'm fine with it. I don't want to do it. I don't know how that would contribute to," and so on. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I guess it's a really interesting question for me, and it's been my main area of research over the last 10 years or so, actually.
Right.
But it often surprises people because, like, both of those training activities that you mentioned, endurance training and strength training, like they kind of sit at opposite ends of a continuum, where at one end you've got very, very intensive exercise represented by lifting weights, that you only do that for a few repetitions and then you have a break. And at the other end of the scale, you've got, running a half marathon or a marathon, which takes 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours at a time. So it's very, very low intensity and very continuous in nature. And I mean, what we know from the research is that engaging with a program of strength training, so I'm talking about doing strength work a couple of times a week for a period of a few months, seems to give us an improvement in running economy of somewhere between about 4 and 8%. And that's partly because
that's a big percent, that is.
Yeah, it's quite a sizable percent. In terms of performance, it's a little bit less, so it tends to be more like 1 to 2% change in performance.
Right.
But in terms of the amount of energy that our muscles are using, that definitely reduces by between about 4 and 8%.
Wow.
And it's mainly because running economy is partly determined by neuromuscular capabilities.
And what's that for those who don't know what that is? Sorry.
So that's essentially how the muscles are producing and controlling force.
Right.
And so I guess if we break that down further, if you think about when your foot hits the ground, like initially your muscles and your tendons both lengthen. And so your knee starts flexing and your ankle starts flexing. And then you change direction and you push back off the surface. And so that action of the knee and the ankle flexing, and then pushing back off, like it will use quite a lot of energy. And so if we can essentially train the muscles to control and produce forces better, like we end up using less energy at a muscle fiber level. So that's what reduces the amount of energy that we're using during the run. And so like what runners often report, and this is a little bit more kind of anecdotal and based on their feedback, is that they kind of set off at a pace that they can sustain. And then after a few miles, they're kind of like, oh, this feels a little bit easier than normal. And that's partly because of the strength training that they've been doing for the previous few months. And so they're able to kind of end up speeding up a little bit because they've saved quite a lot of energy in the early stages of the event.
Sorry, Richard, it dropped.
Yeah, that was weird. It suddenly just said no internet connectivity and dropped out.
I think, well, whatever we discuss has been saved. So yeah.
Yeah. Luckily, I'd pretty much finished what I was saying to the answer to that question. So hopefully it will come across in quite a tidy way.
Yeah. No, that's there. Right. Anything else that you wanted to say about that particular point?
I don't think so. Like I guess the only other thing to mention is you mentioned before resistance training or lifting weights, and like generally the way that I'd categorize like strength training more broadly is heavy resistance training. So that's the heavy lifting weights. More explosive strength training. So that's trying to move a fairly lightweight very, very quickly and trying to improve power. And then something known as plyometric training, which is essentially jumping, hopping, bounding type activities. And all three of those seem to be effective. And so it's probably worth runners like varying the types of strength training that they're doing at different times of a training year and trying to place a focus in different areas so they can maximize the benefit from all three of those modalities.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. Injuries are very common in runners, and nowadays I think it's becoming more common in everything. I think we're glued to our chairs, and the enhancement of technology, entertainment at home, our sedentary behavior as a whole has really increased. But then we get people who don't really train, or they do the warm up, or they're not really preparing for the running and the endurance, or even when they go gym, for example, working out, they really go on and start lifting heavy weights, and then turn up to be injured, and then you don't see them for the next 3 to 6 months. So I know some people who said to me, oh, we're not going to train. I'm just going to turn up, complete my 10K or half marathon, and then that's it. I'm done till the next year. Some people rely on the World Health Organization physical activity guideline, for example. They just go and do the bare minimum of physical activity, or like half an hour a day, for example, at a moderate level, or they just go and do strength training twice a week, the bare minimum, and then they get injured. So what do you think are some of the main risk factors for such individuals, and what they could do to help reduce the risk of injury?
So it's a really good question, and I mean it's probably something you're aware of, but the way that the research literature tends to look at this is it'll pick kind of like one factor at a time and it'll try to investigate it. But what we're kind of more aware of now is the reason that runners especially, but anybody gets injured, is probably multifactorial. Like it's probably down to a number of different reasons, some of which are within their control. And so probably the biggest and most common risk factor that we see is previous injury, which sounds really simple, but like if you've trained for a 10K or a half marathon before and you got, I don't know, a sore Achilles tendon, or your knee started hurting, like if you train for a different event a year later, the likelihood that injury is going to happen again is really, really high. And so trying to address the reasons why that injury happened, and probably trying to strengthen with some strength and conditioning that specific tissue or musculoskeletal site is going to be really important. I guess the second big factor, and you sort of alluded to this within your question, is simply just training errors, as we call them. And
Yeah.
so what we see people tend to do is, as you say, they're in their kind of normal routine, which is either sedentary or it's just going to the gym regularly. And then they suddenly decide, oh, I'm going to train for a 10K or train for a half marathon. And so within the space of a few weeks, they ramp up the training volume and sometimes the intensity as well. And then lo and behold, within a couple of months, they've got some sort of injury. Like what we kind of know from the literature is that if you've got a coach, so somebody that sort of knows what they're doing and can kind of advise you, that seems to produce less chance of getting injured than if you just guess yourself, or you just follow your own intuition, or you follow some guidance from the internet, which sometimes isn't appropriate. And so that's really important. And then I guess the two other really quick ones that I'll mention is nutrition. And so we know that particularly with well-trained runners and elite runners, if they're in a state of what we call low energy availability, so they're essentially just not eating enough to fuel their exercise demands for a long period of time, that can often result in injuries, and particularly bone stress-related injuries. And then just a really, really simple one is just the importance of sleep and rest. That if you're overloading your body with more running and more just general training to prepare for an event, if you spend the rest of your day kind of on your feet, walking around shops, like maybe a runner's doing some sort of manual type job, it's really, really difficult to get enough rest and recovery for your tissues to recover for the next training session. And so, that seems to correlate quite highly to the risk of injury as well. And so I think with those sort of four different factors, you end up taking a very sort of multidisciplinary approach with the way that you try to manage injury, rather than just trying to focus on one individual thing. It's a little bit more holistic.
No, thank you for that, Rich. You kind of alluded to something which kind of is very important from my point of view, that you can kind of explore on the nutrition aspect, and also the social media platforms that nowadays we have so many different coaches online and nutritionists online, for example. And I know some personal trainers, they also give nutrition advices as well, or they come up with a nutrition program. Now, the general public don't really understand who to really follow, because someone comes up with a nice body shape, physically fit, and saying, okay, have this protein, have this carbs, and this is how many days you train, and you're going to get the results. Others are saying otherwise. What do you think people should follow in terms of or who should they really go to? Because it became so difficult with the media now, that it's hard to identify who to follow in terms of actual coach or personal trainer or nutritionist or dietitian. What's your take on that to the public, and where should they go for the right information?
It is really difficult, that it's and it's, I think even if you go back 10 or so years, it wasn't really like a massive issue. Whereas, as you say now, because of social media platforms and people trying to promote their businesses, and you get a lot of influencers these days, it's inevitable that you end up following whoever's site just looks best, just looks the prettiest, rather than the person that knows the most or is giving the best advice. So I guess my advice would be to probably just scrutinize a little bit what the person's qualifications are. That if you're looking for a strength and conditioning coach or a nutritionist, or some a kind of health wellbeing type coach, they should have a certain level of qualification that allows them to offer advice. I'd always be a little bit suspicious of any sort of influencers or trainers on the internet that are giving very, I guess we could call it either extreme or quite polarized advice.
Yes.
So following a diet which sticks to just one food group, or something that isn't particularly balanced, I'd always be a little bit suspicious of that type of approach. And it's the same with strength and conditioning, that if you you see somebody on the internet that says this is the best exercise, everybody should be doing it, and you shouldn't really be doing anything else, I'd be a little bit skeptical of that type of advice as well. So someone that's offering a little bit more balance, if they're adding some evidence and they're saying scientifically, this is the reason why we're doing this, and this is a peer-reviewed study that lends support to it, then you can probably trust it a little bit more. But yeah, I guess the overriding best advice is just not to follow social media too much.
Yeah,
and
no,
to kind of
definitely.
seek out somebody that is qualified and
Yeah,
is working at a sort of accredited either gym or training centre, or better still, a university, I guess.
absolutely. I think that that's a great idea, Rich. And many people that I know, or they come and speak to me sometime and says, "Oh, I'm following this person, and he has a good physical shape, and then he's sharing these contents on social media, which the emphasis as is on one particular thing, and then also that route or that plan has worked for that particular individual." And then I'm like, I don't know if we can generalize this to the
Yeah,
public, for example, as we said. And then when I come to it from my scientific point of view, as you mentioned, where's the evidence and where's the peer reviewed and the qualification of this individual and so on. Some people that just don't want to listen and say, "Oh no, look, that person is more fitter and he's doing this," but we don't know what's going on behind the door. She might be having all of that carbs and everything that he or she is kind of saying to the people don't have it, or the extra protein and the training. So it's definitely, I think, worth to do a bit more dig deep research and reach out to the people who are actually scientists
yeah,
and
exactly.
coaches qualified enough. Yeah, no, thank you for that. You also looked into, or some of your research is looking at the strength training and the bone health markers in endurance runners. And if you don't mind sharing some of the key findings from that research, and then how can we take that findings and apply it to the general public if we could?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting area, this, and like we know poor bone health just in society generally, it is quite a big problem, like
Yeah,
particularly with postmenopausal females and just older individuals more generally. Like the prevalence of osteoporosis
yeah,
and fractures seems to be going up, and seems to be
mm,
a major problem, and a reason that a lot of older individuals end up losing their life, sadly.
yeah,
Like more specifically with runners, to answer your question, is that like when we initially start a running program, if we've not done any running before, like the running itself will be a really good stimulus for improving bone health markers.
right,
But as
yeah,
I mentioned before, it's quite a low intensity stimulus. So quite
mm,
quickly, the bones kind of like desensitize, or they stop adapting to the loading that we're placing upon them. And so to further improve bone health and reduce the risk of things like osteoporosis in later
mhm,
life, it's really important that people are doing like higher intensity type training. And so
okay,
that includes strength training and some of the
mm,
activities that we spoke about before.
mhm,
And so particularly, so did a piece of work with the Royal Osteoporosis Society just last year,
mhm,
actually. And again, similar to what I was speaking about before, there's two main types of strength training that are really key for
mm,
bone health, and this is both in runners and the general population. So progressive resistance training, which is essentially starting off by lifting some light weights and gradually
mhm,
increasing the load that we're
right,
lifting, and keeping the
mhm,
repetitions quite low, so less than 12 repetitions per set. And then high impact jumping exercise,
right,
particularly any sort of jumping exercise where we're changing directions as well. So if you're
mhm,
hopping from one leg to another, if you're jumping from side to side, like they're all really, really good exercises to drive
right,
changes in bone health markers. And so with the runners that I work with, even at quite an elite level, those are the types of exercises that we'll be doing to try to improve bone health, offset the risk of them getting stress fractures. And it's the same for the general population, but I guess usually at a slightly lower level and a lower intensity, that it's important to engage with that for the
right.
purposes of preventing osteoporosis in
Mhm.
later life.
If somebody, for example, has arthritis or osteoporosis, and if they're age, let's say 50 beyond, and is there any kind of evidence, say, if they haven't done exercise, because we know people who hasn't done exercise almost all their lives, and then once they start to having these diagnoses, if they do start to then engage in exercise, for example, would it help to reduce the pain, or would it still improve the bone health at that time
Yes.
when especially when they're diagnosed with osteoporosis, for example?
Yeah, it's a really good question, that,
Mhm,
because like if an older person has got very, very
mhm,
frail and brittle bones, like there is obviously going to be, and if they've had fractures in the past, there's obviously going to be this
mm,
fear that they're going to suffer another bone injury by engaging
Right.
with some strength training. Like the key thing there is if the exercises, again, we come back to supervision, if the exercises are
Yeah.
supervised by somebody that's qualified and technique is good, then this seems to be a very, very low risk of that person suffering from a fracture as part of the activity. And then it should drive changes in bone health and lower the risk of them getting a fracture as part of their everyday life. Like the examples where people do suffer fractures or some sort of injury in strength training is usually when either they've lifted very heavy loads and it's not appropriate for their stage of or their stage of progression, or they're doing the exercise in an unsupervised environment and they're not too sure how to lift the weight or what type of weight to lift. And so the consensus statement that came out around the use of strength training for osteoporosis last year, that's what the advice was, that it's definitely safe, it's definitely effective, providing that the exercises are being prescribed and coached by a qualified individual.
Right. No, thank you for that. I think it's very important, and I tend to kind of outline in my some of this media work that I do that no matter how old you are, what ability you have, just be a bit more active, for example, trying to do something for yourself. And that's really important. I think it seemed like last time we were looking at it, I think the content that I kind of put in the different languages that I can speak in has reached over 2 million people. And the messages thank you. And the messages that I receive are really kind of helpful messages and exciting messages that people say, oh, I used to have a back pain, but since I started doing this exercise, it helped. Or you shared that idea and it helped. I think doing this podcast, for example, with you as an expert in this area would actually help and motivate and instruct more people to kind of get into those areas of do something for themselves, so to avoid injuries as well as other health conditions, for example, which are easily either preventable or we could delay it at least if we kind of do these exercises, which shouldn't take too long anyway. For example, like
no, exactly, they don't take long at all. And I mentioned before the resource that we developed for the Royal Osteoporosis Society, and it's worth signposting listeners to that because the basic exercises. So there's some short videos and explanations that go over the top, but the exercises that we recommend on that for people that haven't exercised before and are maybe in their 60s, 70s, 80s, they start at very, very low levels, and the types of exercise you can do in your home, you don't necessarily need a gym, and then they gradually increase in terms of intensity. And so they're really useful resources, and certainly worth listeners taking a look at them if they want to engage a bit more in exercise.
Definitely. What I'll do is I'll try to find that link and then put it into the description of this video as well.
Yeah, great. I'm more than happy to send it through for sure.
Please do. Thank you. Yeah, I remember one of the things when I was doing some research on employees' health and well-being, and one of a person in a senior management said to me that he started exercising after 50 years, and he started going to the gym, and that's only because his doctor now told him that he needs to be more active.
Yeah.
And the reason he hasn't exercised for so long was because of the bad experience that he had with his PE teacher when he was in school. And since then, he hasn't participated in any activity. But once he started going to the gym, he started feeling better. That blood pressure has reduced. And also, I think he has some joints problem, and that has improved. So there's lots of evidence from people that suggesting, exercise is a great helping mentally and physically and all of that, the conditions. So
yes, yeah.
I looked at some of your work that you were doing, that you're currently, I think, doing is strength and conditioning for endurance runners.
Yeah.
And for example, and how does the availability of the energy and exercise does and the eating disorder side of it. Now, I looked at the eating disorder from the exercise psychology point of view in my subject and physical activity and a bit of nutrition. But I was quite excited to see, and I thought I have to ask you this question, like, can you tell us a little bit more about this research and how can we then apply this to the general public as well, from your point of view, from your field point of view, especially, I'll give you an example. Like we talked about the social media influence earlier. I know some people that I work with quite closely. They follow YouTube advice from people God knows who they are, and also some TikTok now, which is becoming more and more influential. And they started reducing their food by the advice that they were giving online, and participating in more exercise. But now that person has developed some other health conditions and lost a hell of a lot of weight than she should have. And then one of my friends said to me if I could help, and I looked at it, and then I said, well, this is more of a dietitian job, for example, and also needs to seek a medical attention. So if you don't mind shedding some light on that area, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. It probably falls into two main areas. One that's heavily related to athletes and performance, and one is, as you mentioned just there, is more related to adolescents that have had an eating disorder and are going through recovery. And so, yeah, firstly with the sort of performance and the athletes, the angle that I was kind of originally interested in is we've got low energy availability, which is essentially athletes training very, very hard. So they've got this huge energy expenditure, and they're just not kind of capable of eating enough to fuel the exercise and the training that they're actually doing. And so that places their bones at risk because of perturbations that we get in hormones in the body, both in males and in females. And then me as a strength and conditioning coach, I'm kind of responsible for, as we said, the resistance training and the plyometric training, which is this really, really strong osteogenic stimulus, which drives changes in bone. But you've kind of you've got a conflict there. So you've got athletes that aren't eating enough, but you've got an exercise which is really good for bones. And I kind of came at it as, well, is the strength training actually doing anything? Is it actually giving them any sort of positive stimulus to their bones if they're not fueling their performance well enough? And so we've done a couple of studies, and we've got another one which we're just analysing the data on at the moment. And it does seem to be the case that if you engage with strength training, it doesn't really offer as much if you're not fueling your performance well enough. That it's the nutrition and the energy intake which has to be the kind of cornerstone, as we say, which is absolutely key if we want to drive changes in bone health. And so it doesn't mean to say that strength training is a waste of time if you're not fueling performance well enough, but you're probably not optimizing adaptation to the same extent as if you were fueling performance very well. So yeah, that's been one side of the research. The more recent research, which I mentioned before, is we're working with a number of clinicians based around the UK that deal with both young athletes that are performing at quite a high level, and then athletes that are just, I guess, interested in sport and physical activity at a more recreational level that have suffered from an eating disorder. And if they've been diagnosed kind of clinically with an eating disorder, you kind of alluded to it before, but it is very much rooted in their psychology and their kind of perceptions of themselves and their body image and so on. Yeah. So it's obviously that side of things that needs treatment and needs work with clinicians to correct it over often quite a long period of time. But again, the angle that I came at it from as a physiologist and an S&C coach was, well, at some point, these youngsters and young athletes, they want to get back into their exercise, even if they've been doing it to quite an excessive level at some point. And usually what happens is they start returning to their sport, which might be gymnastics, it might be endurance running, it might be playing football or whatever. And they just kind of ramp up their training volume quite quick because it's the kind of sport that they enjoy. And as we've mentioned before, if they've had an eating disorder in the past, the likelihood is that they've got a low amount of muscle mass, their bone health's pretty poor, their kind of general robustness to injury is pretty low. And so we're just doing a couple of different studies at the moment, which is looking at the changes which are possible during that kind of recovery and return to training and performance stage. If we place some strength training in there as priority before they return back to their sport. And so they're kind of increasing the level of sports participation slowly, but alongside that, we're trying to get them to do 2 to 3 sessions a week of structured strength training activity to try to get improvements in muscle mass, improvements in bone health and joint health. And then we can measure those sorts of things in the lab to see if there's been any changes over kind of a 6-month period. And so, yeah, that research is still ongoing, but we've got lots of kind of anecdotal support for it from both the young athletes that are participating, and then more importantly, like the parents who have obviously kind of been through the whole journey with them, and are very, very concerned and bothered about their welfare, and kind of just want them to get back to a sort of healthy, balanced lifestyle, really. And the feedback that we're getting from the parents is incredibly positive, and a lot of them want to come back and have repeat sessions with us. And it's been pretty successful so far. So hopefully the research results will say the same thing.
Well, we hope so, and I think it's a very interesting and important area to look into. I remember a couple of weeks ago when I was looking at some of the literature and in the eating disorder and in sport in particular, we know that elite athletes, for example, or at an academy level as well, depending what sport they participate in, so they have to prepare for different tournaments or competition, and based on that, their body weight has to be in a certain way, for example, or the certain food they can eat, and that also has a knock-on effect on those young people as well. And then not everybody becomes a professional athlete, for example, and then they kind of go into other jobs, and so that all of that kind of continues with it. So thank you for that. Rich, I didn't get the signed copy of this book, but I do have the copy. I've read the book. It has helped me with my endurance, with the running that I do, and the strength training that I do.
Oh, thanks very much. I really appreciate that.
No, thank you. I do highly recommend the book. I will post the link as well. But for those people who haven't yet got a copy, what can you tell them about it? And also, is this for anyone who just wants to do exercise and endurance running, or is it for coaches or just elite athletes, for example? Who can really utilize this book?
Yeah, thanks again for buying it and promoting it. I do really appreciate that. And the way that I tried to write it was to be accessible for as wide an audience as possible. So I did want it to be useful for you very much recreational runner that's just starting out, and equally you really high performing and maybe even an elite runner that wants some guidance around their strength and conditioning. And so I guess in that sense it's a bit more of a sort of self-help book. Like I tried to avoid putting too much in there around, a bit like we were saying before, really, like this is the best program or this is the best exercise to do, because it doesn't really exist. And so like what's in there is some kind of like home-based screening and testing. Like it's got chapters on resistance training, like bilateral, unilateral training, some upper body stuff, and then some specific tissue conditioning to prevent injuries. And then at the back end, it's got, well, how do you put all of that together into a program? And it's got a few case studies, but they're not supposed to be case studies that people can copy. And the other feature, I was kind of very aware that you can kind of like describe, I don't know, how to do a squat, for example. Yeah. But people will do that at home, and they're like, well, am I doing it right? Like, am I doing it wrong? Or somebody else will see them and go, that's not a very good technique. And so I've got a little bit in there around coaching on the exercises. So like for each exercise, these are 3 or 4 common errors. Like make sure that you're not doing this, and this. And if you are, then this is how to correct it, or this is what to think about in order to change your movement pattern. So I tried to get a bit of a balance between, the kind of the basic stuff, a little bit more sciencey stuff, and some coaching as well. So hopefully it caters to like a fairly wide audience.
Oh, it does. I think certainly does. I think my next question was for those people who wanted to kind of start recreational running, for example, and wanted to incorporate some sort of strength work, and what your advice would be, what kind of program they would follow. But then I think I'm going to take the same, buy the book, and the programs are here, unless Richard wants to share something on it in addition. But honestly, this has the book actually has helped me a lot in reduction of the injuries, and also certain things the way I do it now. It has helped me, and I can't recommend it enough. So definitely,
yeah, no, thanks. I'm more than happy to go through like I guess a bit of a rough program that would cater for most people. Like there's always going to be some individuality in there, but like I think a well-rounded resistance training program for both just general health and runners. Like if you can include some sort of squatting exercise, if you can include a hip hinging exercise, such as a deadlift or a glute bridge, if you can include some sort of movement pattern that represents a lunge, so like a split squat or a reverse lunge or an in-place or walking lunge, and then include a stepping exercise, so like a dead leg step up or a single leg squat or a barbell step up. Like that's 4 lower body exercises.
Right.
And if you can do sort of 2 to 3 sets to start off with, that's then like a fairly well-rounded program, and you're not going to go too far wrong with it. So as we said, there's probably some individuality that needs to be added in there. But if you were to stick to those 4 main movement strands as a runner, you've kind of got your bases covered. It's obviously important to do a little bit of upper body as well. So certainly for general health, like we need to be doing upper body pulls and pushes. So for example, like a pull up and a push up as basic body weight exercises. That's kind of 6 exercises in a program, which represents a nice, well-rounded approach. And I guess the other area, which probably don't need to go into too much, but it's just the more kind of explosive strength and plyometric type training. And certainly for general health and older individuals, like we know that explosive power drops off at a faster rate than maximal strength does, and is really important for just general functional living. And so doing some sort of jumping type exercises for health, and as we've spoken about, bone health as well, is really important. So starting off with, I don't know, kind of like skipping type exercises, even with a skipping rope is fairly low intensity, and then building up the intensity. So you may be jumping on and off boxes, you're doing hops and you're doing bounds, is a little bit more intensive, but it's certainly going to help for sure.
Definitely. Well, thank you for that. Rich, you're one of the renowned strength and conditioning coach, both nationally and internationally. You work with various elite athletes. What's your most memorable or proud moment as a S&C coach, for example?
There's been a lot. I've been really lucky with the environments and the people that I've worked with over the years. And I think your natural answer is always, some sort of international athlete that's won a medal at a national or an international championships. Nice. But I don't think I think probably the prouder moment, or the more memorable moments, is with some of the younger athletes that I've worked with in the past, that particularly runners, like they tend to gravitate towards running. This isn't all young runners, but a lot of them tend to gravitate towards running because they tend to be a little bit quieter, a little bit more kind of introverted in their personalities. Yeah. They kind of like an individual sport. And with some of the strength and conditioning kind of classes that I used to run when I was based down in London, they were a little bit more sociable. It's just that kind of gym environment where they're working in small groups, like they get the opportunity to kind of chat amongst themselves, and it's different to a running environment. And there's been quite a few parents that have said to me over the years, your strength and conditioning classes have really improved their confidence and their social skills, and they've kind of come out of their shells a little bit more compared to other sports that they've done in the past. And they've kind of appreciated that side of things more than the things that I'm always bothered about, like have they got stronger, have they got faster at running, and that sort of thing. And to the kids and to the parents, that's far less important than the kind of psycho-emotional skills that they're developing. And it's something that, I was never aware of until somebody, like a few parents sort of said it to me. And I think, things like that are more rewarding than the sort of physiology and the biomechanics.
Well, that's a great aspect. So there's a psychological aspect into it. So you're all-rounded psychology, physiology, nutrition, everything, which that disciplinary approach is really important. And I think for the young people in particular, once their confidence increases and once they get the love and the respect that they deserve, I think they'll continue in that sport and they'll excel as they move along. So that's great. And thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I know you speak about a lot, Saf, as part of your work, but like exercise is supposed to foster those sorts of things, that it's not just about doing something all by yourself and you kind of track your own progress and don't speak to anybody. Like the reason why things like CrossFit have been so successful, and then all these other sort of functional fitness type initiatives over the years, and even Couch to 5K as well, and Park Run is another example. is the social aspect that they kind of
Absolutely.
they kind of bring people together that have
Yeah.
got some sort of shared vision or goal, and they're kind of chatting and socializing together as part of doing exercise, and then they kind of want to go back because the environment is enjoyable aside from all the sort of physical effort that they've got to put in. And so, like if you can find that type of environment and enjoy it, like you're much more likely to maintain your motivation long term.
Absolutely. Rich, I guess my last question is, we have people who are only doing strength training or weightlifting, the resistance aspect. But on the other side, we also have people who are just sticking to cardio, for example, or running, or vice versa, whichever their plan is to do. And of course, I understand people have different plans and goals in achieving. That's why they might be engaging in those kind of activities. But what's your advice to the people who is doing one and completely isolating the other?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to speak in an ideal world that everybody's following the kind of World Health Organization guidelines and what the UK government want us to do and all these sorts of things. But it's it's really difficult to achieve. And this is obviously what you've been working on for the best part of a decade now. And it's like, I'm kind of, and I don't know if you disagree with this or not, but I'm kind of like if people can find a physical activity or a sport or a modality of exercise that they enjoy, and they're happy to stick at it for not just a few months, but years and years, like just long-term engagement with physical activity and exercise. Like I think for sort of just the general public, like it sort of doesn't matter what that is as long as they're doing it. And so if people enjoy playing five-a-side football or playing cricket or going to the gym and lifting weights, like great. Like if they can stick at that for years, like you compare those types of people to the vast majority of the population that are doing absolutely nothing, and like they're going to get some decent health benefits. I guess the only thing I'd say about strength training, like I think I saw a statistic the other day. I think it's like less than 10% of the UK population that do regular resistance training, which is really low. And I mean, most of the current evidence that's coming out around resistance training suggests that it offers similar health benefits to cardiorespiratory exercise in terms of cardiometabolic disease and kind of mortality rates and these sorts of things. So, and it's that kind of like higher intensity paradigm of exercise. And I think I say this in an unbiased way, but like if people do have a choice or they want to pick a type of exercise, like I would always argue that something like strength training should probably be prioritized. If they're not willing to do that, or they haven't got access to a gym or another facility, but they're willing to do something else, that's definitely better than nothing, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But and I think it's important. Like sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I hope that's a kind of balanced answer.
I think it is, and it's, for me, I've always emphasized that continue do whatever you like and enjoy. For example, as long as you are active, whether that's the strength training, whether that's walking, just get your bum off the chair and move. That's all we've been emphasizing on, and it helps, And
100%. Absolutely. I think as academics or as sort of health promotion practitioners, like I think if you try to force people into doing certain things, and you're like, no, you have to do this. Like it ends up working the other way, doesn't it? Because they're just like, well, I don't really enjoy doing that, or I don't really want to. So they end up doing nothing rather than the activity that they probably enjoy doing. And so it's finding what people enjoy, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think that's sometimes like some of my research was to look into what people wanted to do, what's their baseline data, and then based on that propose certain intervention, which didn't turn out to be successful. And one of them was providing standing desks in the workplace. If you remember when we did that research at BCU, and since then, those people, I think, when I came back to BCU last year, and I'm still seeing them, they're using standing desks. And I use standing desk at both home and at workplace. And so things like getting them from that sedentary position to standing, and then once they stand up, then we can actually help them to move and walk, from walking to jogging. So it's a step-by-step process. But Rich, Thank you so much for your time, for your input. I think it's great content, and some of the things, and especially the misconceptions that we talked about, the social media aspect that people watch and follow. I think this is a much not much, but this is the accurate advice that they need to follow and watch out for. But thank you for your input. I look forward to see you again.
Yeah, no, thanks again for the invitation to come on, and we covered some really good ground there, so hopefully it's useful for all of you listeners.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much.